United we play, united we win.
Deep right field, another absolute bomb over the flag
all the time.
We are family.
Outstanding effort again.
We're busting ours to kick yours.
That's big time.
-15.
Respect all, fear none.
Oh, did he belt that one?
Intensity is not a perfume.
It was a no-doubter.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
We are up in the bird's nest here at Oriole Park at Camden Yards. I'm Brendan Mortensen alongside Annie Klaff, back in person for an 11 a.m. podcast for the first time in weeks, I think.
I think 3 weeks that we're back here in the podcast room.
Wow.
Yeah.
That is a long time
That is
without
a long
an in-person
time. We're busy
podcast.
people.
We are. We've
Not
been
for-
all over the place.
Not from a Barnes & Noble this time around.
I think we should keep doing podcasts from a different Barnes & Noble every
I think
week.
so too.
I think that would be a good bit.
Right next to the stuffed animals as well. So lots
Yeah.
of kids and people behind me in the window where the decal says books.
Yep. Well,
as well.
you've got to know what they sell, and it's books, in case you didn't know what Barnes
And
& Noble
stuffed
sold.
animals.
I wouldn't have known what Barnes & Noble sold if it wasn't for that decal that said books.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
thank goodness for that. But it's good to be back here in person. We've got to talk about injuries today. That's what
Classic.
we're going to be talking about once again. Every week I start the podcast with, man, I sure would like it if I didn't have to talk about injuries this week. And now we are just leaning full force into it and talking about injuries for literally the entire time.
I think the baseball gods were listening to you and they said, you know what? We're not going to give Brendan his wish.
Yep.
We are going to give him a more jam-packed injury podcast.
The exact opposite, actually,
Yeah.
of an injury-free podcast. We are going to get into later just the amount of injuries that the Orioles have had this season. Spoiler alert, it's 23 guys on the injured list, which leads Major League Baseball. We're going to talk about the impact that that has had. But we are going to start short-term with some of the new injury updates that we have. So, since our last podcast, we have had injuries to Zach Eflin, Chadwick Tromp, and Jorge Mateo. Our last podcasts have included Adley and Maverick Hanley injuries, the Cade Povich injury, the Mountcastle and Mateo injuries, and now here we are with more of them. So we'll start with Zach Eflin. He goes to the injured list with low back discomfort. He just hadn't really looked like himself since coming back from his initial injury. 7.16 ERA in his 9 starts since returning. That's not Zach Eflin. I think there is, you could look at the sample size from the end of last season and say, man, he was an elite starting pitcher. This is a number 1, number 2 type of guy. And you can look at the last stretch of 9 games and say, okay, that's a rough stretch. I think you can probably attribute that to maybe just not being 100%. I mean, he's given up 17 runs in his last 3 games. That is not Zach Eflin either. So I think there's probably a world in there where Zach Eflin is a really solid number 2, number 3 type of guy, and it's certainly not the pitcher that we have seen over the past 9 starts.
And it was a really weird kind of situation where it felt like it was fluctuating from like decent starts, good starts to, okay, the last 3 were consistently really bad. Like you mentioned, the 17 earned runs in those last 3 starts. So it kind of felt like those middle 3 starts were pretty decent. 3 of them were quality in that middle group of those 9 starts, but it does make you wonder, like kind of how we were talking about with Jordan Westbrook at the beginning of the year, where it really just felt like something was lingering with him, where he wasn't 100%. The injury hadn't fully subsided, and maybe there's a different one, and it definitely did not feel like the characteristic Zach Eflin that we knew from the beginning of the season and the late parts of last season as well. So hopefully, at least with this stint, like it just takes a little bit of time just to get back to how he was before. Even if it takes a little bit of time, maybe he just needed a reset to begin with anyways, because the command wasn't like Zach Eflin, and we saw that from even Tomoyuki Sugano, who hasn't necessarily been himself as well. So there's been a lot of fluctuation with this starting rotation. They looked really good towards the end of May, beginning of June, and now they're back to a little bit of kind of sink or swim.
Yeah, as you mentioned, there were 3 quality quality starts in there for Zach Eflin. A couple of weird starts where it was the blow up against the Nationals, and then he tries to pitch in the pouring rain in Boston and gives up a couple of home runs. So that game you kind of threw out a little bit, and then there were 3 quality starts after that, and you felt like he was getting back to himself. But the last 3 games have just been really rough, and everybody's dealing with something in baseball. There are very few guys around the league that probably feel 100% at this point in the season, halfway through. So I think everybody is just trying to work through it. But for Zach Eflin, it was something that was clearly impacting him enough where he has to go on the injured list. And it's another tough blow for this rotation. As you mentioned, Tomoyuki Sugano has not been his best self over the past few starts, but he has still been a reliable guy to post every 5th day. You've seen pretty drastic improvements from Trevor Rogers, Charlie Morton, and Dean Kramer. Those are the solid 3 right now at the top of the rotation. Sugano in that conversation, too, for what he did at the beginning of the year, and you feel fine that he's going to turn things back around and be a solid pitcher for you here. But you just don't have a ton of options. Trevor Rogers was the guy who comes up to replace the injured Cade Povich, and Povich was a depth option. So without Zach Eflin now, Brandon Young was called up and is still trying to find his stride in the big leagues a little bit. But after Brandon Young, I mean, there's no Cade Povich. Chase McDermott has really struggled in AAA. Are you looking at a guy like Cameron Weston as another option? I don't really know where the Orioles go from here. Brandon Young is hopefully just going to be the solution until Zach Eflin comes back, but there's not a Kyle Gibson waiting in the wings at AAA. Maybe you could try to see if there's another depth option out there that you could bring in on a minor league deal. I don't really know what the solution is. All I know is that not having Zach Eflin and Grayson Rodriguez at the top of the rotation and then not having Cade Povich and Albert Suarez as depth options is not good.
Right.
It's not a good place to be.
It's definitely not ideal, that's for sure. But it feels kind of different from last season, where last season there were a lot of injuries, but it kind of felt like last season was like, okay, the big name starters were injured, where it was Bradish and Means and Wells and everything, and I mean, even relievers too, Danny Coulomb. And this year it kind of started out with the depth pieces with Rogers and McDermott, Suarez, and you never knew where he was going to stand, if he was going to be in the 5th rotation spot or in the reliever group. And then it starts to hit you with Rodriguez and Eflin. So now it's kind of compounding with both, where it's like you are out of your number 1, number 2 guys, and you still don't necessarily know what you're going to get from Dean Kramer, Charlie Morton, and Tomoyuki Sugano, but you're also kind of out of your depth guys in Chase McDermott, Trevor Rogers. It has been a really unlucky one, especially because they had made a lot of progress in the offseason to get depth pieces, and that's what they did successfully in the offseason, I would say, because Morton and Sugano have been those guys.
Right.
But it has just been a really tough blow, and you need some more out of Trevor Rogers. Hopefully with at least Brandon Young, hopefully he can just get a lot more reps, because it was only his 4th start last night.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Yeah, as you mentioned, it's the same issue that we were talking about at the beginning of the season, where you can weather one of those 2 storms. If you have some of the top guys out in the rotation, in this case, if it's Zach Eflin, Grayson Rodriguez, and Kyle Bradish, you can get by with quality depth, which they brought in with Albert Suarez, with Trevor Rogers, and you have waiting in the wings in AAA in Cade Povich and Chase McDermott and Brandon Young. But the fact that Povich is out, Suarez is out, Rogers missed time, McDermott missed time, and the top end of the rotation guys missed time, you can't weather both of those storms at the same time, because depth is the solution to rotation guys going down. You can't have the rotation guys go down and the depth guys go down, because then you don't have any solutions.
Right.
And that's nothing against guys like Brandon Young, but Brandon Young is being asked to do a lot. I think it was fair to assume that maybe he would make his big league debut at some point this season, but you're going, okay, hey, Brandon, we're here in July, and the Orioles really need to make up some ground in the standings, and we need you to go out and make some good, solid starts for us and keep us in games and get us to the bullpen, but also don't tax the bullpen. And, you're asking a lot of that dude at this point, and Brandon Young has some upside, and he could be a big league rotation arm at some point in his career, but man, you're throwing him into a tough spot.
Right, and it's different, too, because we saw this with Cade Povich last year, and we saw it with Chase McDermott earlier this year. We're seeing it right now with Brandon Young, where it's different from, if you say bring up Kobe Mayo, Jackson Holiday like last season into a spot where they were in dire need of position players because of a lot of injuries towards the end of the season. It's different to throw those kind of guys in and tell them, okay, there's a lot of pressure right now. We're still trying to make a playoff push because there's still 1 out of 9 batters in the lineup.
And they're also top 10 prospects in baseball.
But this is a lot different where you have a lot of responsibility as a guy like Brandon Young, Chase McDermott to hold your own on the mound when it's one of maybe your first 5 starts as a big leaguer.
Yep.
It is a lot to ask of them, that's for sure.
Yeah, and it's not a position you wanted to put any of them in. If those guys are going to make their big league debuts, it's probably going to be because of injuries, but throwing them into the fire like this is a tough spot to be. So for now, the solution is Brandon Young, and hopefully Zach Eflin spends the minimum time on the injured list, but you got to get some of these guys back and healthy because a rotation that includes Eflin and Rodriguez and Bradish, along with really the quality turnarounds that we've seen from Kramer and Morton, the great stuff we've seen from Trevor Rogers. Tomoyuki Sugano has been outstanding for a large majority of the season.
Suarez last year.
Albert Suarez last year. You feel really different about this rotation if it is healthy, which is, again, the topic of this entire podcast, because we've got more injuries to talk about. Let's go on to Jorge Mateo, out 8 to 12 weeks with a hamstring injury. I don't know what is going on with these just bad hamstring injuries.
So bad
for this team between Jorge Mateo and Ryan Mountcastle that are keeping them out a long time. That's a doozy of a hamstring injury. Jordan Westberg dealt with it for a little while. Bad luck with hamstrings for this team. But Mateo, it's just tough for a guy that really never found his stride this season. It's a tough spot for him to be in. Not really getting many starts. Jackson Holiday has established himself as an everyday player. Gunnar Henderson at shortstop is, of course, an everyday player. There's not a natural place where Jorge Mateo fits in to make, even somewhat inconsistent starts. He has a role on this big league roster, and it was being a speed and defense guy. He got thrown into some tough spots, too, trying to play center field when he's not a natural outfielder because of injuries. Again, you just needed this guy to do a little bit of everything. He was mashing in Norfolk, by the way. 4 games back with the Tides. He was rehabbing, hit .462 with an OPS over 1,100 and didn't strike out. This is just a really unfortunate setback for him.
I know, and he's had a really tough last year now because of the weird collision last year with Gunnar Henderson, the new collision this year where the elbow had to be doctored and take caution over that a little bit. So he has just really been through the ringer with injuries, and it's never something that you want to see. And people can say as much as they want of his offense and his defense, but still, a depth piece like him, like you mentioned, his speed on defense and on the base paths is really something that you could need just regardless of how he's doing at the plate or missing catches or whatnot. He's just something that the Orioles probably need regardless just because of depth.
Yeah, it's a good depth piece. You can look at the offensive numbers and wish that there was a little bit more there, but Jorge Mateo wouldn't have been on this big league roster if the coaching staff didn't feel like he was valuable in certain ways. And he certainly was from a speed and defense perspective. And it's a tough guy to not have because he fills those roles very well, even if it's not a role where he's starting 3 times a week even. So Jorge Mateo, another tough setback for him, wishing that he has a speedy recovery there from that hamstring injury. Another injury to get to.
The next one.
Chadwick Trump to the injured list with a back strain. By the way, Gary Sanchez also hitting the finger in last night's game. Yeah. Tony Mansolino said his concern level is low, but he is getting x-rays, and we are still waiting to hear on the results from that. I can't even imagine a world where Gary Sanchez goes down at this point because he would be the 4th catcher on the injured list because Chadwick Trump is the 3rd.
And we haven't even really talked about Jordan Westberg's playing through a finger injury as well, too.
Yep. So Westberg is fighting through some things. Gary Sanchez potentially fighting through some things. But Trump on the IL, Adley and Maverick Hanley are already on the injured list. So Trump is the 3rd catcher to be there. He was injured on a weird swing, tries to get out of the box and was laboring down the line a little bit. Gary Sanchez was DHing that game. Trump has to come out. Gary has to catch. Trevor Rogers has to bat against the Rangers. Really weird game. But the takeaway is that the Orioles just need a body to catch a baseball game. Gary Sanchez has been outstanding over the past few weeks. He is really, really hitting the ball well. I know there's some defensive question marks, but you can't really ask for much more from Gary from an offensive perspective. Jacob Stallings gets the call. The Orioles just brought him in after he was waived by Colorado. Had a tough start to the season there, but had an 810 OPS for the Rockies a season ago. So Stallings is the corresponding move. This guy with a lot of big league experience. He has a Gold Glove a few years ago and some solid offensive numbers. Could probably make an argument that, he's got more big league experience than Maverick Hanley and Chadwick Trump. Maybe if the season shakes out differently and Stallings is brought in at the beginning of the year, he's your third catcher, but you probably wanted to give him some more time to get acclimated to the organization. Only had a handful of games in Norfolk before he gets called up.
Right. It's definitely a tough position to be in where it's a new club. And, yes, he is a 10-year veteran and a former Gold Glover, which is good that you have that kind of experience. But still, it's a whole new club, and it's definitely going to take a little bit of time to adjust, most likely. But, again, it is never good when your two backup catchers get injured as well. Yep. On top of Adley and Maverick Hanley, it's just no good. But it is a good thing, like you mentioned, with Gary Sanchez, especially with how he's hitting with runners in scoring position. That is huge to have him right now. But Jacob Stallings is interesting because it's someone that I think we kind of discussed briefly in the offseason when they were trying to sign a free agent backup catcher. He has some interesting numbers. When he was a Gold Glover in 2022, he had 8 blocks above average, and that was when he had that really highlight season as a defender. Last year, though, 10 blocks above average. That was in the 94th percentile. This year, not so much, but like you mentioned, he hasn't necessarily had a consistent season right now, so hopefully he can get back to those numbers defensively. Offensively, I'm not sure he's going to be able to provide much or as much as Gary Sanchez is, so at least you have someone to fill that backup role.
The backup catcher. Yeah, losing track of how many backups we've just said. But Stallings is, look, on the list of guys that you could bring in as an emergency, we need a body catcher. I think Jacob Stallings is probably pretty high on that list as somebody who is a 10-year MLB vet, like you said, has a Gold Glove under his belt. Yeah, it might not be giving you a ton of value offensively. With all due respect to Maverick Hanley and Chadwick Trump, they weren't giving you a ton of value offensively. Their value really came in the little things, in the defense, in calling a game. I think those are things that Jacob Stallings has been good at throughout his big league career, and so hopefully he can bring that to Baltimore as well, even if the offense isn't really there. You're just going to take what you can get out of somebody who is your backup catcher. Catcher. Exactly. Whatever it is. I think the natural question with Stallings getting the call there is kind of like we talked about last week. Hey, where's Samuel Basallo? Because he is tearing the cover off the ball in AAA Norfolk, but I think the takeaway is the same thing that we said a week ago when they called up Chadwick Trump instead of Samuel Basallo. The Orioles have a plan for Basallo. They don't feel like he is major league ready at this point for whatever reason. Offensively, it seems like he is doing a lot of really, really great things. Maybe they want him to continue to get work behind the plate. We have mentioned a bunch of times that he does not have a ton of games catching this season. Maybe they want him to get more work at first base. He looks pretty good at that spot. And maybe you might need him as a left-handed hitting first base option in a couple of months. Who knows what ends up happening with this roster, right? So you just want to put Samuel Basallo in the best position to succeed for his long-term future, and you aren't going to risk calling him up too early and stunting his development in any way, shape, or form just because you have injuries. And then if Adley Rutschman comes back in a few weeks, what are you going to do? Send Samuel Basallo back down? I think when you call Samuel Basallo up, he is going to be up for the long haul. Yeah. And you don't want to rush that just because guys keep getting injured. And who knows? Maybe if there's another catching injury, then it's Samuel Basallo time. But the priority for the Orioles clearly seems to be, okay, we are not calling him up, and I don't care how many guys get injured. we are prioritizing his long-term development.
Right, and I 100% agree with you where it's like, okay, they made the mistake once before with Jackson Holiday, and Mike Elias was even the first person to admit that maybe we did call him up before he was fully ready and capable to have great big league at-bats. And we also saw with Kobe Mayo and Jackson Holiday where they needed consistent at-bats to fight through their struggles at the big league level. Kobe Mayo is getting that right now with Ryan Mountcastle down on the injured list as well. You wouldn't be giving that to Samuel Basallo because Adley Rutschman is expected to come back shortly after the All-Star break, and hopefully that is a short stint for him on the injured list because he was doing so well at the plate and just defensively in general, just because it is Adley Rutschman right before he got injured. You wouldn't be giving that to Samuel Basallo if you called him up right now because they would probably have to have Adley Rutschman and send back down Samuel Basallo, so you wouldn't be giving him those consistent at-bats that he would need to fight through the struggles like Kobe is getting right now and like Jackson Holiday ended up getting last season. It also would be interesting, too, in my opinion, because you mentioned like you could have him at first base if you needed a lefty in the lineup, but also just in general, if you brought him up and prioritized him as first baseman, then you're also taking away reps from Kobe Mayo at that point, too, which is also not what you want to do because he is starting to get more and more comfortable right now, the most comfortable we've ever seen him in the big leagues.
Yeah, there is a natural spot for Samuel Basallo on this roster at this very specific present time. In the few weeks that Adley Rutschman is out and Gary Sanchez is still healthy and you need a backup to Gary Sanchez, that is the role that Samuel Basallo would fill on this team right now.
Right.
And in a few weeks' time, when Adley Rutschman comes back, Gary Sanchez is not getting optioned, right? We'll see what happens at the trade deadline. This roster could get shaken up. You never know what needs the Orioles might have in a month or so. But as the roster currently stands, the only window where Samuel Basallo would get consistent playing time as a catcher is right now. And so you're not going to rush that. You are going to wait until there is a role for him that makes sense for the long term and the play itself makes sense for his long-term development.
Right.
For where he is just as a baseball player. And again, he is 20 years old.
Right.
Samuel Basallo is going to be a good big league player. I think everybody who sees him swing a bat can probably agree on that. That is the priority over a few weeks of needing a backup catcher where Samuel Basallo, you would want to have him up here and get consistent reps. And like you said, you don't want to take those away from Kobe Mayo. You don't want to take those away from other guys that need development on this team as well. And when everybody is hopefully back and healthy on the catching side of things in a few weeks, there's not a natural spot for him to fit in until you make the conscious effort to say, okay, Samuel Basallo's here. This is how many starts he's going to get at catcher. This is how many starts he's going to get at first base or designated hitter. You're going to have a set plan for him, and I'm sure the Orioles do, and that plan does not involve being an injury replacement.
Right. I just don't see them budging in terms of making him an injury replacement instead of just prioritizing his development, which is what and it just goes to show you how much they value him. And for all those people saying trade Samuel Basallo, no, this is a pure indication of why that they value him as a prospect to make him be the big league contributor that they all know he's going to be.
Yeah, absolutely. That is the priority for Samuel Basallo. It is to make sure that his long-term development is top of mind.
Right.
So that's what the Orioles are going to continue to do, and it is clearly the strategy moving forward. Now, let's just talk about the injuries in general. Now that we have gone through all of the individual injuries that have happened miraculously in the last week since the last time we podcasted and had to spend 25 minutes on those injuries. The Orioles have had 23 players on the injured list this season. That is an astonishing amount of guys to be on the IL. They currently have 13 players on the injured list, which is tied for the most in baseball with the Astros and Mets. And as of yesterday, the average among big league rosters was to have 7.5 players on the injured list. The Orioles have almost double that. And I think you can look at the Mets as a kind of example of even one of the most, expensive teams in baseball from a roster construction standpoint. They have been decimated by injuries over the past few weeks, guys like Kodai Senga. They are 12-15 in the month of June, and they went 3-13 over their final 16 games of the month. Injuries can go a long way in tanking you in that regard. Now, you can look at the Astros, who's the other team that had 13 guys on the injured list, and say that they went 19-7 in June and found a way through it. Sure, it's not an exact science to say that if you have X amount of injuries, you are not going to be able to win Y amount of games. But it doesn't help.
Right.
It's just a tough spot for any team to be in, and it is not just the Orioles that are struggling by having this many guys on the injured list.
Right, it 100% is not just the Orioles. I mean, if you take a look at even the division, the Red Sox have had 23 total guys on the injured list since spring training. Some of those could have been carried over from last year. 12 of them are current, and of those, 66 of them are on the 60-day injured list. The Yankees, too, have been hit. Luis Gil was a big one. He's probably going to be starting his rehab assignment soon. Garrett Cole was a big one as well, the TJ surgery. So it is definitely not just them, but they are leading the pack. And one interesting thing that I found in an article from MLB Trade Rumors was, and this was as of June 11th, so keep in mind that this is before Adley's injury. This is before Zach Eflin's second new injury and before Cade Povich hit the injured list as well. They were looking at projected WARP, so wins above the replacement player, which projects the total value taken away by players who are on the injured list.
Yeah.
The Orioles ranked second in that category. The Dodgers and the Yankees were up there as well, but when it comes to the total value taken away, just because the Dodgers and the Yankees have a lot of really deep rosters and really strong talent across the board, and of course they're still winning, so they're clearly doing just as fine. But the Orioles had a lot of guys that would have been able to provide value if they had not been injured, and they rank second in that category as of June 11th before Adley and Zach Eflin's second injury and Cade's injury and you name it.
Yeah, I mean, the names on the injured list, too, are huge ones. We're talking about Adley Rutschman, Kyle Bradish, Grayson Rodriguez, Zach Eflin, Tyler O'Neill, Ryan Mountcastle, Colton Cowser, Jordan Westberg, and Gunnar Henderson.
Right.
That have all been on the injured list at some point this season.
You could form a starting lineup and a starting rotation with just the people on the injured list.
Yeah, and I know, that the Dodgers are an interesting example because I'm pretty sure everybody on the injured list for them right now is a pitcher, either a starting pitcher or a reliever, and I think they have 10 or 11 guys on the injured list. So, yeah, the Dodgers have been decimated pitching-wise, but their lineup is still fine.
Right.
And the thing that's been the biggest issue for the Orioles is that you have the top of the rotation guys that have been injured, Kyle Bradish, Grayson Rodriguez, and Zach Eflin, and then there are also lineup guys that are really injured as well. I tweeted out a stat this morning. If you look at kind of the core construction of this lineup, there are guys, obviously, like Ryan O'Hearn and Cedric Mullins that are outstanding pieces. But if you're just looking at the young core of hitters, you could probably classify that as Gunnar Henderson, Adley Rutschman, Jackson Holliday, Jordan Westberg, Colton Cowser.
Yep.
I think those are probably the five guys that make up the young core of this lineup that are everyday players that are going to be in there all the time. The Orioles have played 85 games this season, and those five guys have been in the starting lineup together 6 times. There are 2 series in which those guys have been healthy for at the same time, and it was 2 series against the Detroit Tigers and the Tampa Bay Rays, who are 2 of the 5 best teams in the American League. Now, in those 6 games, the Orioles went 3-3, but you had to face the starting pitching of... So in the 6 games, one of the games was a Tigers bullpen game, and the Tigers have one of the best bullpens in baseball. And then you faced Casey Mize, Tarek Skubal, Zach Littell, Ryan Pepio, and Drew Rasmussen, who are 5 of the best starting pitchers, in the American League. And the Orioles still went 3-3 over those games, where they had all 6 of those guys in the starting lineup.
Which says something.
They appeared in 7 games together. Adley Rutschman didn't start one of those games against Tampa. He appeared later as a pinch hitter. But they faced 5 of the best starting pitchers in the American League against 2 of the best teams in the American League and went 3-3 with their 5 core young pieces in the lineup. They've played together 6 times in
really
85
sad.
games.
It's really tragic.
And it's unfortunate because how do you evaluate a team like that? I know that looking at injuries and saying, man, the Orioles just aren't playing well because of injuries, players have talked about it where nobody wants to hear that as an answer, right? But how do you not have it as an answer when it's been to this extent?
Right.
It is so hard to evaluate this roster and the moves that Michael Elias and company have made. You can say whatever you want about the offseason and, hey, they should have done this or they should have done that. We have not seen what the plan was in the offseason. The plan in the rotation was to bring in Charlie Morton and Tomoyuki Sugano and have good depth pieces in Trevor Rogers, in Albert Suarez, Chase McDermott, and Cade Povich to back up the front end of the rotation in Grayson Rodriguez and Zach Eflin. And then eventually, later on in the season, you get Tyler Wells and Kyle Bradish back. That was the plan in the starting rotation. That plan has literally never once come to fruition this season because Grayson Rodriguez has not pitched. Zach Eflin has spent now 2 separate stints on the injured list. And Trevor Rogers has missed time. Chase McDermott has missed time. Cade Povich has missed time. So you have never seen what the plan was for the starting rotation. You've never seen what the plan was for the lineup. As mentioned, 6 games with those core 5 guys healthy and in your lineup. So it's really hard to evaluate the moves that have been made and what this roster is really capable of doing because we haven't seen the roster play baseball together.
Right, and it's not like we're trying to say that, okay, they didn't not underperform because we did see cases of that where this core had underperformed for when they were healthy, where Adley Rutschman, it took a while for his metrics to translate. Gunnar Henderson, it took a while. He has been making a lot of progress ever since he was kind of starting slow, just like the rest of this offense. And Ryan O'Hearn, Jackson Holliday, Cedric Mullins were the guys to kind of keep this offense afloat. But at the same time, it is, like you mentioned, really difficult to not say, okay, this lineup for a lot of this season has never been the way that it was intended to be in the offseason and just the way it is intended to be because of injury. And last season was difficult too because, yes, they had a lot of injuries and that was a big topic of conversation for us for why, okay, maybe they didn't make it into the playoffs as deep as they could have because they had injuries with Jordan Westberg, Ryan Mountcastle, Ramon Arias, a lot of the infield and position players towards the end of the season when they're making that playoff push. That didn't necessarily happen towards the later parts of the year where you had position player injuries last season. Last season, it started off with a lot of, rotation pieces and relief pieces where it was more so kind of like what the Dodgers are facing right now, where it was a lot of pitchers and not necessarily position players. But this season has been both. Yeah. Where you started out with depth pieces on the injured list. You started out with your number 1 and number 2 guys in the rotation on the injured list. Some other depth pieces like Albert Suarez and Cade Povich have now entered that equation as well. And then you also started out with Jordan Westberg, Gunnar Henderson having issues, Colton Cowser having injury-related topics or injuries related to the beginning of the season as well, where yes, you started out slow because of underperformance, but at the same time, it was never the way that it was supposed to be from the early parts of the season. Right,
and even early on this year, you didn't have an overlap of Gunnar Henderson and Colton Cowser, who are your two of your best left-handed hitters in the lineup alongside Ryan O'Hearn and Cedric Mullins and Jackson Holliday. Like, Colton Cowser has come back and already has 7 homers, which is towards the top of the team lead for a team that, doesn't have one guy mashing a ton of homers this year like they did last season with Anthony Santander and with Gunnar Henderson. Anthony Santander, who was also on the injured list for Toronto, by the way, in case you were wondering if the Orioles bug of injuries just extended when guys left and went to other teams. It has extended to both Anthony Santander and Corbin Burns, unfortunately, this season. So maybe it's just an Orioles affliction. I don't know, but you've never seen this lineup be what it's supposed to be, and you haven't seen them be able to find a stride. I think somebody like Tyler O'Neill is a good example too, where, Tyler O'Neill started the season slow. He has 24 games. The OPS isn't where you want it to be. The batting average is below 200, but he was also in the middle of a lineup that was just struggling in general. They weren't really finding their stride. They weren't putting at-bats together. I think Tyler O'Neill, if you give him a bigger sample size throughout the season, his numbers are more than likely going to come back around. And a lot of the offseason moves in general, I know Tyler O'Neill has struggled in that small sample size, but Ramon Laureano has been a godsend. I mean, he has been absolutely outstanding this year with an OPS close to 900, batting 280.
Yeah.
He has been way more than you, I think, expected him to be in the offseason. He has established himself as one of the best players on this team this season. Tomoyuki Sugano and Charlie Morton. Obviously, Charlie Morton starts the year really slowly, but he has come back around. Tomoyuki Sugano has had a tough last few starts, but started the season on an outstanding note. I think a lot of the offseason moves have either performed well or just haven't been able to fit in a context that they are able to really thrive in.
Right.
Because those supplementary pieces, for the most part in the offseason, like Laureano and Morton and Sugano, have been doing a lot of good things. I think Tyler O'Neill, once he is back and healthy and hopefully is able to find a stride for a longer stretch of time, maybe his offensive numbers turn back around. But the core of this team is not healthy. You're missing Adley Rutschman and Ryan Mountcastle right now. You were missing Colton Cowser and Jordan Westberg for an extended stretch. Even when you do get Westberg back, he is not going to be 100%. He admitted that himself, where the finger is just, he's trying to get it playable and passable because he wants to be out there, and he's just trying to get to the All-Star break where he has a few days off and then maybe things can heal a little bit. But you've just never seen it come together, and it's unfortunate because whatever vision there was for this team and the record that they could have and the kind of baseball that they could play, they've never had the opportunity to put it all together.
Right, and I want to acknowledge a comment on YouTube too, because we were the first people to admit and bring up that every single team is dealing with injuries. That was one of the first things we talked about, where, yes, we know that the Dodgers are still doing really, really well and have a lot of injuries. We know that the Yankees had the same thing with Garrett Cole and Luis Gil.
Yeah, like Corbin Carroll is hurt in Arizona, and the Diamondbacks are struggling. Hunter Green is hurt in Cincinnati. Wyatt Langford in Texas. Pablo Lopez in Minnesota. There are plenty of guys that you can point to and say, man, this team's having a hard time because this guy's out.
And we're not saying that injuries are an excuse. We're just saying it doesn't help when your core of this entire Orioles identity and this young core has been injured at either the same time or at different times. So you've never had that true lineup 1 through 9. And the Dodgers are a perfect example. Like you mentioned, everyone on their injured list right now is either a relief pitcher or a starting pitcher. Their entire lineup is as is and how it's supposed to be intended to.
Yeah.
Yes, the Orioles have a lot of pitchers on the injured list, and sure, you can argue that maybe they should have done more in the offseason, but at the same time, they grabbed depth pieces, and it's just really unfortunate that some of those guys have hit the injured list.
Yeah, and I don't think the point that we're trying to make here is one of, this is why the Orioles record is what it is at this point. I think the takeaway is it is really hard to evaluate this team when we have not been able to evaluate this team. That's kind of my general takeaway. There are guys, like you mentioned, Adley Rutschman had a slow start to the season. Gunnar Henderson had a slow start to the season because he didn't have a spring training. Colton Cowser is, coming back around but missed a ton of time. There are guys that you can look at and say, okay, maybe there's a little bit of underperformance there. That happens throughout a season. There's overperformances too. There are guys that are outplaying expectations. Ryan O'Hearn, Ramon Laureano, you can throw into that conversation, that have really overperformed what we were expecting from them in this offseason. That's all credit to them. But it's just really hard to evaluate this roster when we haven't seen them on the baseball field at the same time. Because if the Orioles are going through this season with the MLB average of 7 guys on the injured list, and you don't have Colton Cowser missing months, you don't have Jordan Westberg missing months, who are 2 of your most important players, Adley Rutschman missing weeks, Gunnar Henderson missing a week plus at the beginning of the season. If you don't have that, I don't know where the Orioles are. And I'm not saying that these injuries are 100% the reason that the Orioles are how many games they are below 500. And man, if these guys were healthy, then they would be winning the AL East. I'm not making that claim because we don't know.
Right.
If the roster was healthy and playing and able to put whatever their best product on the field was, we would be able to see what the vision for this offseason actually was, but we can't.
Yeah.
We just flat out can't, based on the amount of injuries that the Orioles have had this year. So it's not an excuse to say that their record would be X amount of games better if this guy wasn't injured for this stretch of time, but it just makes it really difficult to evaluate this team, evaluate the moves that have been made, because we don't have the information of what this team looks like.
And when you mention that stat of, okay, the five main guys have only played in the same lineup together for 6 games, there was a short period of time where when Colton Cowser came back from the injured list, Westberg came back, Mullins came back, Laureano came back, even I would lump him into an everyday piece that's become an everyday contributor this season because of Tyler O'Neill's injuries and whatnot. But we haven't had that much time. At that point in time, we would have said, okay, this is the healthiest this lineup has looked all season. Fortunately, it was very short-lived because Adley Rutschman hits the injured list, and you name it, but it was just, okay, that was probably the only time we would have been able to evaluate it, and it didn't last long whatsoever. Yep. So you really just hope that the All-Star break can help for guys like Cade Povich, Adley Rutschman, other guys on the injured list, so that hopefully in the second half they can come back and just be a little bit more healthy.
Yeah, and a lot of the comments I'm getting on my post from this morning about the lineup not playing together is, well, that doesn't explain the pitching. Okay, you mean the pitching staff that doesn't have Kyle Bradish or Tyler Wells or Grayson Rodriguez or Zach Eflin or Cade Povich?
That's a given.
Yeah, the starting rotation would look a lot different if you had, I know you knew that you weren't going to have Kyle Bradish coming into the year or Tyler Wells coming into the year, but you haven't been able to evaluate this pitching staff with what it looks like with Grayson Rodriguez, who, by all accounts, based on his development and trajectory, could have been the best starter in this rotation this season. You have not seen that guy be healthy for the entire year. Zach Eflin has 2 stints on the injured list, and with Grayson Rodriguez out, based on his track record, he is probably the best guy in this starting rotation that you would look at as your potential number 1. So, yeah, sure, the guys out in the lineup don't explain why the pitching staff has struggled. They have their own set of injuries that have really contributed to their struggles. So, again, who knows if Grayson Rodriguez and Zach Eflin are healthy for the entire season, what this starting pitching staff looks like. Charlie Morton was healthy at the beginning of the season and still really struggled, but he has turned things around. Dean Kramer, the same way, had a tough start to the season. He was healthy, yeah, but he's turned things around. Those ebbs and flows naturally happen during a season, and who knows what the Orioles' record would have been in those early months if those guys were, still healthy and still struggling, but you also had Eflin and Rodriguez. That's the point. We don't know. And it's hard to evaluate this team knowing how many injuries there have been. That's the takeaway. Right. Not that they would be better, not that the record would look drastically different. Just, hey, this is a really hard team to evaluate because they have been so injured.
And it does come back to the fact that, yes, we're seeing it all across the league and in the majors because, okay, like you mentioned, Corbin Burns, who knows if that would have happened. You can say all you want that in the offseason the Orioles should have put all their money and time into getting Corbin Burns back. Who knows what would have happened because right now he's out for the rest of the season. Anthony Santander, like you mentioned as well, you could have put all your money and time and effort in getting him back. Who knows if he would have been as much of a contributor as he was last year on offense and a producer. He's also on the injured list. It's not just happening to the Orioles. That's not what we're trying to say, and it's not an excuse. But at the same time, you would never be able to predict anything like this, and you would never be able to analyze how a season has gone if that didn't happen.
Yeah, and I understand that it's baseball and you have to weather a storm, and there is that argument. It's a big storm.
Yeah.
It's a really, really big storm to try to have to weather, but the Orioles are going to have to find a way to do it because the calendar is now in July and it is crunch time. And we kind of talked about it last week, but there is a obvious deadline at the end of the season where you're either in the playoffs or you are not. But there is a also literal deadline coming up at the end of this month where you probably need the record to be at a certain spot to determine what the Orioles are going to do at that deadline, whether they are going to try to make a playoff push at the second half of this year. They're still going to try to do that, obviously, but does that include potentially trading some guys that could help you do that at this trade deadline because you are trying to go, okay, hopefully we get guys back and healthy and we're looking a little bit longer term down the line. So these next few weeks, the Orioles have the guys healthy that they have, and there is quality depth on this team that is hopefully going to be able to step up and help these guys win some more baseball games over the next few weeks because they need to before they get to that deadline, which is one that kind of will play a big part in what happens in the second half of the season. But I think that'll just about do it for this week's edition of The Bird's Nest. Thank you so much for following along with us live on our YouTube and Facebook channels. We love reading your comments. Be sure to drop us some questions. We'll talk about it on the podcast, all that good stuff. But if you didn't follow along with us live at 11 a.m. every Wednesday, you can catch us after the fact on Spotify, SoundCloud, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, wherever you get your podcasts. You can find us here on The Bird's Nest. We've got a big show next week with our MLB draft preview. We have been in the lab. We have been in the kitchen. We have been cooking. We have been doing everything possible to do all of our draft prep. We are going to have our huge MASN All Access draft shows. The Nationals on the other side have the number 1 overall pick. That'll be an exciting time here on MASN. And then the Orioles have 3 picks in the top 31 at number 19, number 30, number 31. We have some really fun plans for that draft show that we are excited to tell you about next week during our draft preview. So make sure you tune in there to see what the Orioles are going to do, some of the top names that could be coming off the board for Baltimore at picks 19, 30, and 31. But thanks so much for listening. Big thank you to Amy Jennings behind the scenes for producing this one. For Annie Klaff, I am Brendan Mortensen, and we'll catch you next time.